Greetings from the World Health Organization. I'm Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. I'm the chief scientist here, and I'm so honored and privileged that I can share some of my reflections with you all, discussing the future of global health and what the pandemic has taught us. It's been an absolutely tumultuous year. It's been extremely challenging, and it's also been gratifying but humbling as well, because as the year went on, we realized that we knew very little about this virus. At the beginning of 2020, we kept learning more and more, and I don't think we're finished learning yet. And so while the science has really evolved at an unprecedented speed, and we're actually in a position where we have vaccines available within 12 months of the discovery of a new virus, and that's an amazing testament to science, there are still knowledge gaps, and there are still things that we have to learn about this virus, which will help us as we try to come to an end, bring an end to this pandemic, but also prepare for the future. And today I want to be able to reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned and what it means for countries, what it means for politicians, for policymakers, but also for communities, for individuals, as we try to rebuild our lives. And the first thing I would say is that the pandemic, apart from the fact that it's infected close to 120 million people and killed over 2.6 million people around the world, and these are just the known and documented cases and deaths. We know that this is an undercounting, both of infections and of deaths. There are so many impacts and shocks felt by people not directly related to getting ill from COVID and dying, but really the impacts on livelihoods, on education, and particularly I think about the impact on women and children in many countries, and we know that violence against women has increased, that people have been pushed into poverty, and that inequities around the world have been exposed in every country. So it's within every country and between countries. We see now the glaring gaps in people who were able to cope and manage their work and not lose their jobs, and those who were already just on the edge, just about surviving, and have now been pushed off that. And there's a huge uncertainty that lies ahead for them. I want to start by reflecting on what happened to health systems around the world. And we saw that there was really no ideal health system that was able to cope with this kind of a shock. And particularly surprising was the fact that so many high-income countries that have very sophisticated health systems, that have excellent hospitals and doctors and specialists and intensive care units, seemed to bear the brunt and seemed to have the highest case fatality rates and the largest number of deaths. And the gap there, I think, has been in the public health workforce and system, which has got eroded over the years in many of these countries. On the contrary, the lower middle income countries, which do not have the most sophisticated tertiary healthcare services, many of them have invested in community health programs and primary health care. And because they're used to infections, used to dealing with tuberculosis, with malaria, and with HIV, they were able to perhaps do better with things like case finding, contact tracing, making sure that people are provided supportive isolation and quarantine facilities, setting up some social support networks, and so on. The countries in East Asia, which had been through SARS-1, actually, many of them learned their lessons and had really geared up their health systems to deal with this type of infectious disease shock. And countries like Vietnam and Singapore and Hong Kong and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, we saw that the response, and China, was very aggressive. It was early, it was well thought out, it was based on the knowledge of how the virus behaves and what's needed, did not necessarily involve large, prolonged nationwide lockdowns, but focused on the essentials of being able to test and trace and track and quarantine and isolate and keep the virus transmission down at very low levels. Now, the WHO did a survey of countries in the middle of last year to see what happened to health systems. And we found that 80% of countries that came back and reported back to us said that their essential health services had been disrupted to some extent. And this was felt most acutely in the low-income countries because you already have a stressed health system with a limited workforce. Many countries do not have enough doctors. They rely a lot on nurses and community health workers, and they were completely overwhelmed by having to take care of COVID. So things like immunization services, antenatal care, treatment of non-communicable diseases, cancer, all of these suffered, including things like essential surgeries and blood bank services. And so there is a fallout beyond just the COVID, which the impact of which we are still haven't fully measured, I think, in many countries. So really the lesson there is that you need resilient health systems in terms of a workforce, in terms of supply chains, in terms of data systems, in terms of having people at the sub state level, at the lowest level of administration who understand epidemiology and disease control. And of course, you also need a well-functioning administrative support system that can provide support to the public health actors and specialists at a time like this. Now, we've seen beyond the impact on health systems, the impact, of course, on livelihoods that we talked about. We know that the global economy is going to contract, by a huge 4 to 5% in 2020. It's estimated another 130 million people will go into poverty. And we know that the Sustainable Development Goals, our attainment and the path to that is going to be derailed unless policy actions are taken very quickly, especially in favor of the poorest people, because global poverty is on the rise for the first time since the 1998 Asian financial crisis. In 1990, the global poverty rate was about 36%. It had come down to 8.6% by 2018, but it's likely that that's already risen and will continue to rise through 2021. The majority of workers in Africa and other the least developing countries, over 80% of workers do not have access to any social protection. And therefore, the economic fallout is likely to last well beyond the health crisis. Global human development as a combined measure of the world's education, health, and living standards is on course to decline for the first time in 30 years. And it's clear that the pandemic has shown that development is no longer just going up the ladder, the direction has changed. And based on the socioeconomic impact seen across countries, the recovery path must include a new human rights-based, just and fair social contract between governments and the people. We need to advocate for social safety nets with a broader reach, universal health insurance and health coverage, affordable access to digital connectivity. We've seen, again, the digital divide between those who are able to continue to work and to school using online access and a large number of the world's poor who were not able to access those services. We need global collaboration and solidarity for an effective response. And again, we need to focus on the basics, make health as a human right, ensure that health is a priority for investments by every government, and that universal health coverage is the only way out to prosperity, really, because without good health, there is nothing else. And I think the pandemic has shown that extremely clearly. So investing particularly in primary healthcare services, in good surveillance systems, in a good, well-trained workforce, in sustainable financing for the health system, which can be increased at the time of such shocks, in supply chains, and very importantly, also in community engagement. Health systems where communities are engaged and empowered to act have done much better than health systems where there's only been a top-down approach to solving the problem. The other area I'd like to touch on is on global innovation and research and development. Now, this, I think, has been the silver lining. The boost that science and technology and innovation has received during this year, the unprecedented speed at which new products have been developed, new diagnostics, vaccines, in 314 days between the public availability of the whole genome sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the first vaccine receiving regulatory approval for use. I mean, this is completely, nobody in their wildest dreams would have thought it possible. The number of diagnostic tests that have now become available, where you now have rapid diagnostic tests, you have self-testing kits, a whole range of diagnostics compared to the same time last year when there was very, very limited molecular testing available. We've seen a huge number of academic, private, and public collaboration, partnerships, and initiatives, all directed at developing technologies that can help with the pandemic. There are probably 3 innovations that stand out here, which will be important for the future and for other diseases. The first is the development of the platforms for vaccines, the mRNA platform and the viral vector platforms. These have happened because of consistent investment in this area of work over the last decade or so, and they have proven to be highly successful. mRNA vaccines in particular can be very rapidly engineered, both to deal with the new variants of the virus as they emerge, but also for diseases like tuberculosis, where we've failed to really produce a successful vaccine. HIV and malaria are the other diseases that really could do with a good vaccine. So we can use these new platforms. As I mentioned, diagnostics, again, a huge amount of innovation, rapid diagnostic kits and paper-based diagnostic tests. I wish we had these for other diseases as well that could be used, at the level of the primary healthcare clinics. Antiviral drugs, there's been very little progress and investment in this. And now there's, again, a renewed focus on developing antivirals, preferably broad spectrum antivirals that can be used to treat SARS-CoV-2 infection, but also other viral infections that could emerge. And so this renewed interest and the global focus on solving some of these big global health problems could provide us a permanent infrastructure that provide major benefits to future generations. But we have to do it wisely, we have to learn from the lessons, and we have to think about a new paradigm. The private sector, we've seen them stepping up in many ways. Without the private sector, we would not have seen the vaccines in the millions of doses that we have today. Of course, we need more. We don't have enough supplies. And we've had a lot of the private sector groups, the World Economic Forum and the CEOs and so on, talk about this idea of stakeholder capitalism. I think we need a new model of R&D for goods that are global public goods. And I think many people would consider vaccines to be global public goods. And this is where we need to put that above the profits of individual companies. We need to think of a model where a new innovation or a technology that's been proven to be effective against a disease is then, we use all the opportunities possible to scale that, to transfer technology to other companies around the world that can manufacture, and to make it available to people around the world, especially where the disease is posing a huge burden, so that we can actually solve that public health challenge. We're testing this now with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine and with the establishment of the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility. For the first time, we have a global facility and a mechanism to promote the development of a broad portfolio of vaccines against this virus, but also to ensure equitable and fair access. This has not happened in the past. I think the COVAX facility is already now rolling out. We've rolled out over 30 million vaccines in the last 2 weeks to about 35 countries. And over the course of this year, the COVAX facility will provide at least 2 billion vaccines to 190 countries around the world. That's a model that should be kept alive for future pandemics and health shocks. the linking of the R&D, so it's an end-to-end, the investments in R&D must translate into products that are then provided at an affordable cost for people around the world, regardless of their ability to pay. So I think we are getting closer to that ideal, but we're not there yet. It will require the cooperation and collaboration between governments, between the private sector, between the shareholders of those large companies, between smaller manufacturers in parts of the world like Africa and Asia and Latin America. If you look at vaccine production today, you see that there are differences between these regions. And to promote regional health security for the future, we need to ensure that both diagnostics and vaccines for emerging diseases can be produced in every continent, so that you have the local capacity and you don't have to depend on very complex global supply chains and the charity of others, because this is not about charity. A pandemic cannot be solved one country at a time. I think we have to recognize, as can other threats like climate change or antimicrobial resistance. These are global threats which challenge us as a humanity, and we need to find global solutions by working together. So to conclude, I would say that governments, civil society, private sector, all have contributed to ending this pandemic and have learned lessons. We now recognize that every government sector would need to be involved in this outbreak response. We cannot, the health department or ministries alone cannot solve this problem, because it goes way beyond that. So you need what we call an all of government, all of society approach. You need multi-sectoral action. You need early, widespread and accurate communication of information, including what is not known. The science has been evolving and changing, and in fact, this is an opportunity. The first time, I think, that you've had science on the front pages of newspapers and television channels almost on a daily basis. And this has given people a window into how science works, but it's perhaps also confused them, because things keep changing. And some people interpret that as, oh, these scientists don't know what they're talking about because they keep changing their mind. But I think that's where we need to build the understanding that that's how science works, that you have to change your policies and your approach as your understanding of the disease improves. We need to communicate early and often. That's what the WHO has tried to do with accurate information. And we need to manage what we call the infodemic, which is really this huge explosion of information that's become available to people. A lot of it is misleading and untrue. And we need to be able to help people to differentiate between credible information and false information. Communities must be engaged from the beginning. It has to be a bottom-up approach, not a top-down approach that will work. We need to engage the entire range of experts, including social and behavioral scientists. It's not enough to have only a biomedical approach. When you're talking about behavior change at the scale, you need the behavioral insights and you need the experts to inform the policies. I've spoken about the importance of investing in public health and primary health care. The role of science, scientists, and public health specialists has become very, very obvious and clear, and we need to invest in those institutions, including the regulatory bodies and countries which have also played such an important role. We need to improve global collaboration on research and development, particularly for products that will help solve our big public health challenges. And as I said, it's not only about infectious diseases, we have other global challenges to our health, to the population that we need to solve. And then the importance of genomics and all of this. Some of these cutting edge technologies has become quite apparent, especially as we see the evolution of the virus, the emergence of variants and so on. There are many countries that don't have these capacities as yet. So again, we need to work as a global community to make sure that every country in the world has the surveillance systems in place, because otherwise we cannot prevent future pandemics. A pandemic can arise anywhere. And I think it's a question of when and not if the next pandemic will be upon us. And so we really need to prepare. We of course have the independent pandemic preparedness panel that's looking at this and will have a report by May that will lay out a roadmap for what needs to be done. But we can already start thinking about some of these things. And finally, I would say that, you know, political will and political leadership has been extremely important and critical in building trust, in community engagement and empowerment, and in addressing the societal inequities that we still need to do for the future in order to build a more just and healthy society. Thank you so much for this opportunity.